This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest this episode, Marc Myers, author of Rock Concert, an oral history as told by the artists, backstage insiders, and fans who were there. Decades after the rise of rock music in the 1950s, the rock concert retains its allure and its power as a unifying experience and as an influential multi-billion-dollar industry. In Rock Concert, acclaimed interviewer Marc Myers sets out to uncover the history of this compelling phenomenon, weaving together groundbreaking accounts from the people who were there. Myers combines the tales of icons like Joan Baez, Ian Anderson, Alice Cooper, Steve Miller, Roger Waters, and Angus Young, with figures such as the disc jockeys who first began playing rock on the radio, like Alan Freed in Cleveland and New York, the audio engineers that developed new technologies to accommodate ever-growing rock audiences, music journalists like Rolling Stone's Cameron Crowe, and the promoters who organized it all, like Michael Lang, co-founder of Woodstock, to create a rounded and vivid account of live rock's stratospheric rise. Rock Concert provides a fascinating, immediate look at the evolution of rock and roll through the lens of live performances, spanning from the rise of R&B in the 1950s through the hippie gatherings of the 60s to the growing arena tours of the 70s and 80s. Elvis Presley's gyrating hips, the British invasion that brought the Beatles in the 60s, the Grateful Dead's free-flowing jams, and Pink Floyd's The Wall are just a few of the defining musical acts that drive this rich narrative. Featuring dozens of key players in the history of rock and filled with colorful anecdotes, Rock Concert will speak to anyone who has experienced the transcendence of live rock. Marc Myers is a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal, where he writes about music and the arts. He's the author of the critically acclaimed books, Anatomy of a Song and Why Jazz Happened. He also posts daily at jazzwax.com. He's a 3-time winner of the Jazz Journalists Association's Award for Jazz Blog of the Year. Marc, how you doing? Thanks for being here.
Great, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Boy, this is an interesting time for this book to come out. We're just getting back to the place where we can actually go to concerts. I went to my first post-COVID concert back in August, went to see Dead & Company here in Connecticut a few months ago, and man, it was good to be back at a show. Have you been to a show since COVID?
No, but how was it? I mean, were you sitting on top of everybody else? Were people jammed in, or
we were all
did they have any
packed
kind
in?
of
You had to have your vaccination card. Didn't have to wear a mask.
If it was yours.
If it was yours, yeah. I mean, people always say to me, it's like, you can make those up, right? I mean, it's not that hard.
I don't know. It's scary times.
That was the concern of mine. The show was outstanding, and
oh, good to hear.
By the way, they played my favorite Dead tune, Wharf Rat, so I was loving that.
There we go.
But yeah, it was still it's in the back of your mind, because everybody's so close.
What was the last concert you went to before the lockdown?
Before the lockdown would have been. Might have been Big Head Todd and the Monsters, maybe, in Port Chester, New York.
For me, it was Hall & Oates at Madison Square Garden.
Oh, cool.
I would say a bunch of weeks before it all went down, but it was scary to think back on how people were just assuming it was just nonsense going to the concert, and then suddenly it wasn't.
We are trying to adjust. I just saw Paul Stanley's guitar tech passed away because of COVID.
Yeah.
52.
Yeah. It's not something to mess with.
Yeah. So this book takes an in-depth look back at the history of concerts from its beginnings in the 50s. And as you write in the book, live music's initial purpose was to transform a gathering into community by unifying an audience's mood. Can you take us back to the very early days of concerts and what they were like before the quote-unquote rock concert era?
In the R&B era, about roughly 1949, 1950, you start to see concerts being held in a really, it's in Los Angeles that this is happening, where what distinguishes these concerts, because there've always been these R&B concerts in black neighborhoods where black bands would tour and black bands would play there, and there would be a whole review of different artists, and that was fairly standard. That goes all the way back into the Jazz Age and prior. But what makes this concert different in 1951 in Los Angeles is that it was integrated, that the arena there, the Olympic Auditorium, sat on the borders of the Mexican-American community and the black community and the Asian community. It had an interesting location. And as a result, large numbers of all of these kids came to see this concert, and the concert was amazing. This is a concert where you've got Big J McNeely, the tenor saxophonist, playing his saxophone on his back. And the kids, the teens, the integrated audience is all at the lip of the stage, pounding the stage. They're absolutely euphoric. So for me, that's the start of the rock concert, or the early days of the rock concert, the model, where you've got an integrated audience. Nobody cares where you're supposed to sit and whether you're supposed to be there or not. They're just overwhelmed by this music. They're transported, and they're just taken away. So it's pretty amazing to see. And the other thing that distinguishes this concert that we're talking about, Eric, is that a photographer was there who was an art photographer. He'd go on to be one of the top still photographers in Hollywood for the movies. But at this point in time, Bob Willoughby had heard on the radio that this DJ was holding a concert at midnight, and he grabbed his cameras and he went down to take a look. And then once he gets there, he crawls around on stage and he's taking pictures of the audience. But it's really the first journalistic art photography documentation of an integrated R&B concert, which, within a few years will become a rock and roll concert, which will then become rock as we know it, arena rock in the 1970s.
And you did say the age group, teens. The early rock concerts drew mostly teens, maybe a few in their 20s here and there, but this was predominantly a place where teens could be with other people their age, dealing with all of the same problems, whether it was just being sick of being told what to do by your teacher or your parents, to taking on the more serious issues like Vietnam War and civil rights. This was 2-3 hours of time when youth culture had a voice.
Yeah, you touch on something very important in the book, and very important in the history of the rock concert in general, Eric, which is that before rock and roll, and R&B in some ways is really music for adults. I mean, it's the sexual innuendo in the lyrics. It's adult music performed by adults, really. But when rock and roll surfaces in 54, 55, it's the first time that the music industry has created music for teens. Prior to that era, prior to early rock and roll, music is not made for kids. It's made for adults. I mean, if you go back to the big band era, even Sinatra, is really, there are girls who are swooning for him, but originally that wasn't teenage music. It was adult music. And it just so happens that kids had no other choice but to listen to their parents' music. But when rock and roll arrives in the early 50s, it's the first time that the music industry is catering to the teenage market.
You talked to Ernie Andrews, an LA jazz, blues, and pop singer. He talked about playing whenever and wherever he could. And it was much like that era's America's Got Talent. This is where young up-and-coming musicians hope to get discovered. Many black musicians as well, which is important. And he talks about being discovered by songwriter Joe Green during a show at Lincoln Theater on Central Ave, a place that he started as an usher. He eventually gets discovered playing on stage. That's a great story.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing in my book, Rock Concert. I really wanted to look at the evolution of how this thing at a sweaty boxing arena in 1951 becomes a $8-9 billion industry in 2019. I was curious. I really wanted to find out, well, how does it go from point A to point Z? I mean, what happens along the way? How does it rise up? How does it transform? What are the factors that influence it? And as far as eyewitnesses go, the over 90 sources I interviewed, I always wanted to find sources who were not the obvious choice. In other words, you look at the cover of this book, which they did a great job on it. I mean, don't you think it sort of looks like a book version of a Harley Davidson? It's all black and there's gold and it's just like a leather jacket or something.
And that's the Who in the mid-70s?
Yeah. The thing is that as the rock concert evolves, I really didn't want to sort of make this book about all the obvious things you think might be in this book, like groupies and drugs and partying. And I just didn't want to make it a cliche. That's the sort of the cliche side of things. I was more curious with how this thing becomes a cultural phenomenon and how it became a teenage rite of passage, and just how the rock concert just comes to dominate. It completely changes America. I mean, when you think about it, the rock concert has a lot to do with completely altering America and making America sort of what it is today culturally, where you've got an emphasis on the youth culture, not on adults. Back in the in the 40s, before rock and roll, the emphasis was on adults. Kids dressed like adults. They couldn't wait to become drinking age so they can go into bars. And childhood was kind of a period of time where you just couldn't wait to get rid of it. You just wanted to move on.
And the book is called Rock Concert, an Oral History as Told by the Artists, Backstage Insiders, and fans who were there. And there are also stories about the disc jockeys from back in the day, which I love. Being an old school radio guy, I loved reading the stories about the radio DJs back in the day, like Alan Freed. In Los Angeles in the late 40s, it's Hunter Hancock and Dick Huggy Boy Hug, who would play R&B music on the AM radio. And a disc jockey from Cleveland, Alan Freed, who is widely known as the guy. Can you talk about Alan Freed and his importance to rock concerts? And also another important name, but often left out of this story, Leo Mintz, a record shop owner in Cleveland. You had the chance to talk to Alan's son, Lance, and Leo's daughter, Leslie, to get some insight into their roles early on.
Alan Freed, he starts out doing jazz and he takes over for a classical DJ one night. And, he wants to play his own thing. He doesn't want to play Beethoven and Schubert. He wants to play, what kids are listening to. And Leo Mintz just happened to sell one of the largest record stores in Cleveland, was selling large numbers of these R&B records. Mintz didn't understand these records at all. I mean, he was selling pop music, pop singers. And, he just said to Freed, he said, come on in and see what's going on. These kids come in after school and they're dancing. He says that they're rocking and rolling. And that's where the term rock and roll winds up implanted in Alan Freed's head. He realizes that this is something that kids are identifying with. That's the thing about Alan Freed. He was a great DJ, great radio banter, and he could really trigger kids' imaginations, while they're, in the dark at night listening to him. But most important, he really identified with adolescents. He sided with kids. He understood their beefs. He understood that teachers were a pain in the neck and outdated. He understood that parents didn't really care much about them, that parents wanted kids to be seen and not heard. They didn't want kids to make, too much of a fuss. It was, eat your dinner, be quiet, go to your room, don't make waves, just do what you're supposed to do and don't make trouble. And Alan Freed really understood that kids were having a hard time with that, and a hard time with, parents, in large measure alienating kids, not really paying much attention to them.
How old was Alan Freed at this time? Was he in his 20s at this time, or is he older than that?
I think he's probably in his late 20s.
Still a young guy. He was as big as any rock star out there.
He creates an enormous appetite on the part of the youth culture for the music that he's playing. And keep in mind, at first in Cleveland, he is playing for largely a black audience. Those who show up for the Moondog Coronation, that big concert in Cleveland, which is often called the first rock concert, but it's not really. I mean, I think it's really the midnight matinee that Hunter Hancock throws in 1951, a year earlier in Los Angeles. But what Freed's big contribution there is that he is of adolescence. He's like an adolescent himself. He understands kids. Kids bond with him, and they are just taken by him. I mean, no one else is really pleading their case. No one else is championing their music taste except this guy, Alan Freed. He goes to New York. He then moves to New York in 54, and he's at WINS, where he suddenly starts calling his show the Rock and Roll Jubilee, and it takes off. He holds massive concerts at the Paramount Theater, which becomes such an important incubator for the rock concert. Almost everybody who had anything to do with music in the 70s went to these Alan Freed shows in 1955, 56, 57, 58. And I mean, think about it. They're just, I guess the only thing you can really compare it to maybe is Comic-Con, where you've got this concert lasting a week to 10 days. If you get there at like 8 o'clock in the morning with a bag of sandwiches, you could go in, sit down, and stay for the entire day into the evening. You'd see the same groups and you'd see the same movies, but you could stay all day. If you left the theater, the seat was vacant. But, this thing where you could go for a week to 10 days, what an indoctrination into, the youth culture emerges and becomes a viable market for business.
I could just picture in my head those kids in the 1950s at school, and they just can't wait to get out on that Friday.
Yeah, and all week. I mean, these jubilees that Alan Freed was holding at the Brooklyn Paramount, they would take place over Easter holiday and over Labor Day and over Christmas. I mean, the kids were off for an entire week. The parents were happy to get them out of the house, so the kids would go and pick up sandwiches at stores and stand online, and they'd be there all day listening to the Platters and Chuck Berry and the Teenagers. I mean, it was just it's hard to fathom today because we have so much access to music online, but to be able to see people you only can imagine in your head, listening to them on the radio, to suddenly see them in a theater and stay all day and go day after day after day. Wow.
Never be able to recapture that again. And the other thing about Alan Freed was he had some guts. He made some decisions he knew he was going to get some pushback from management on. There's a great story Lance tells about his dad, April of 1951, and Alan takes a job at Cleveland's WJW as the host of a classical music show. A fellow disc jockey calls in sick. Alan uses this as his opportunity to play all of these great records he has in his possession, knowing that the station manager is not going to be happy, and that's what happened. He did get into some trouble.
Yeah, I mean, he got in trouble. You know, it was a brilliant move from a business standpoint, because to survive on the radio back then, you needed to find a sponsor. And if you didn't find a sponsor, you weren't going to last very long on the air. You needed to find a sponsor, and that sponsor needed to buy most of the time. Then you'd be in huge demand. The radio station kind of didn't have the tracking services you have today, like Nielsen. Like they didn't care if 1,000 kids or 10,000 kids were listening. I mean, it was good to have an audience. But what the station needed were sponsors. So by getting the record store, by getting Leo Mintz's record store involved, and by playing his records on the radio, Freed was able to help the store sell those records that weren't moving by promoting them. But he was also able to get this guy to buy airtime, to the extent where he allowed this guy, Leo Mintz, up into the studio to hand him records that the kids found popular, like bring the ones that the kids love the most. And this guy, Mintz, would hand Alan Freed these records that were hot in his store, and Alan Freed would play them. He'd get the sponsor of this guy. Then he got a beer sponsor. So he was shopping for sponsors. And I don't know how many sponsors you'd get. I mean, I'm sure that there were some that the classical DJ got who was out sick that day. But Freed's genius there was bringing in big sponsors to pay the bills, for his show.
And you do mention in the book, Alan did get reprimanded by station management. But of course, I'm sure later on, the station management said, oh, no, this is a great move. Great move.
It's amazing what radio station executives forget pretty quickly when that check is written.
Oh, yeah. Lance talked about his dad coining the term rock and roll. Actually, Leo Mintz is, as you said, that was a term, rock and roll, he used to describe teens bopping in the aisles of his record shop. In the early 50s, Alan only used it in passing. He really didn't think about it all that much. In fact, he more often than not referred to the music he played as blues and rhythm records. But it was while Alan was at WINS in New York that he really embraced that term rock and roll. But that's only because he had to, right?
What he's doing in Cleveland is his theme song was, I think, called the Dog Symphony. And it was this really far out beat kind of thing, that was just a lot of sounds and a beat going. And it was to create mystique, create mystery, create a sense that you were in a special place, that only kids were allowed. And he was referring to himself as the Moondog King, and the audience were moondoggers, and he really worked that up into quite a shtick, to quote my grandmother, in the 1950s. But it's when he gets to New York that the real moondog, the guy who's standing on the corner, this blind guy who dressed in a Viking outfit, who chanted poetry. So I guess an attorney came to him and said, "Hey, do you know this guy on WINS is stealing your name? You can make some money." And of course, this guy who's panhandling on the street says, "Yeah, let's sue him." So they sue Alan Freed, and the judge rules that Freed owes him some money and that Freed can't use the moondog term anymore. So Freed just uses as a fallback the Leo Mintz term, or the term that, has been kicking around, and he starts to call his show, rock and roll. It's a rock and roll jubilee or a rock and roll party. And that's really the sort of the birth of this phrase. If you go onto YouTube and type in Andrews Sisters, and rock and roll, you'll find a record that they recorded in the late 30s called Rock and Roll. So the term existed. It just wasn't applied to this youth culture addiction to this music form that Freed was playing.
And as you mentioned earlier, Alan Freed, he knew his audience. He knew what they wanted, and it paid off big time. These kids, they all flocked to these shows.
What they realized early is that anytime you could set up a situation where teenage boys could meet teenage girls and girls could meet boys and they could dance was a win-win-win. There was no downside to that whatsoever. So they'd hold record hops. Anything to get the kids, the teens, to come to these record hops or come to these events and listen to this music and buy the records. And in turn, when you bought the records, the record stores did well. And when the record stores did well, they wrote checks to radio stations because they wanted to be sponsors of the show. And that cycle, that economic cycle begins where this music starts to feed off the kids and the stores get involved and radio starts to profit. And it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
And your book, Rock Concert, an Oral History as Told by the Artist, Backstage, Insiders, and Fans who were there, also gets into the importance of concerts in terms of bringing people of all skin colors together. A great story told by Marshall Chess, son of Leonard Chess, the co-founder of the legendary Chess Records. This is in the chapter on rock concerts in the Northeast in the 50s. He said, in Chicago, I didn't see white and black kids at concerts sitting together. At Alan Freed shows at the Brooklyn Paramount, I did.
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking earlier about the midnight matinee of Hunter Hancock in Los Angeles in 51, the two reasons why that's such an important concert, why I start with that in the book, is that number one, it was integrated, and number two, because that concert was photographed. We have documentation. Maybe it happened earlier, maybe it didn't, but that concert is well documented. Integration in this country is a fundamental element here. Much of the country, including all major cities, including Los Angeles, were segregated in the early 1950s, up until the early 1950s and even later. New York was one of the only cities where segregation was eased in many places, but it still was there. It was still there in custom and economically. Places wouldn't serve certain people. So the races were highly divided. And rock and roll brings them together. Alan Freed's concerts at the Brooklyn Paramount, kids could sit wherever they want. If you look at photographs of rock and roll concerts in the 50s, whether it's Bill Haley or Elvis, some of these other concerts, you'll see that if there's a photograph of the audience, all the black teens are sitting on one side of the theater and there's a rope going down the middle of the aisle, and all the white kids are sitting on the other side. So, you know, what you see with Alan Freed's concerts and what you see with integration is it's a very slow process, but it only existed fleetingly in Los Angeles very early, and then much more in New York. And then it just picks up from there.
The 50s end with the payola takedown of DJs, most notably Alan Freed, and he wasn't the only one, but he took the biggest hit for taking gifts in exchange for playing records. Was Alan their main target?
He actually isn't the main target. There were a whole bunch of targets, including Dick Clark. The names, there's like dozens and dozens of names. But the difference is Congress was able to get their hooks into Alan Freed because he had profited. There was he made $300 on something, and they were able to really work that over. And once he had a choice. He either could admit to taking the $300, or worse was going to happen to him. So his attorney, advised him, ill-advised, or advised him to say that you did it and get it over with. But once he did that, his station fired him, and he was out of work. And it just went downhill from there. He dies, I believe, in 65. But the thing that stands out, though, about that congressional hearing is it starts in 59, ends in June of 60. Congress holds hearings, and they drag all these record industry people in, and they ask them, did you pay? We've got evidence that you were paid all this money to play these records. And it existed. Without payola, you wouldn't have had rock and roll. Without these payoffs, without DJs playing the same songs over and over again. Even with Chuck Berry and DJs and Alan Freed, for instance, when Maybelline comes out, I think, if I recall, Alan Freed just locks the studio door and plays this record like 100 times. Like he's just playing it over and over and over until kids are so hooked on it that they're just going to the record stores to buy it. And they figured out early that the secret to getting kids to part with their money or to beg their parents for some money was repetition. the more they played these records, the more kids would buy them. But the congressional hearings came at a really rough time for the radio industry because there was a presidential election in 1960, and a lot of Congress was up for re-election. And the best way to sort of mobilize your constituency is to be holier than thou and claim that rock was destroying America's youth. And they had to make somebody the fall guy, and the DJs became the fall guy. Yes, lobbyists basically do the same thing, right? Lobbyists go into Congress and spend tons of money to get Congress people to vote their way. That's what lobbyists are. But in the radio industry, where cash was changing hands without taxation, Congress was particularly incensed that this was a cash transaction. And in some respects, a lot of booze, prostitution, gifts, cars. So it was a free-for-all. It was the Wild West. And after the congressional hearings, rock and roll changes. It becomes softer. It becomes gentler. The muscle is sort of taken out of rock, and now it's just a little more moon, June, love, dating, going to the chapel, getting married. It's a softer thing that happens on the other end of these payola hearings.
Well, the 60s start off soft, but as we know, it ends on a whole different note. You write that there are three major factors in the shift in sound by the end of the 60s. Bob Dylan's electric tour in 1965, the emergence of FM radio in the late 60s, and the growing popularity of the rock album. Let's start with Bob Dylan's 65 tour, which, as you write, was largely influenced by the Beatles. He wanted to put down the acoustic guitar. He wanted to plug in, both in the studio and on stage. And I know someone who was at that Newport Folk Festival. That was July 25th of 65, right?
You got it.
That's the show, right? When Dylan performed Plugged In, and he said it was every bit as crazy as the stories we've heard and read. You talked with people who were there that night. What didn't help was the fact that the amps were turned up real loud, and one of the people you spoke with was George Wein, the founder of the Newport Jazz Festival and Folk Festival, and he said Dylan probably overamplified the instruments on purpose to further his statement against the folk establishment.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the interesting thing about folk at this particular time, and folk in general, folk is a highly egalitarian form. Everybody should be equal. Everybody should, nobody should be more special than anybody else. The music was about protest. It was about singing around the campfire. It was about joining in and singing along with the banjo player. But for the most part, folk had extremely, it was left-leaning. It was anti-institution, anti-company, anti-boss. And it talked about the working man. That's what folk songs were about. It was about oppression and the working man, and about how everybody should be equal. A small problem happens with that. Folks fine with that up until about 1964. And in February of 64, the Beatles arrive. And the Beatles, that's just an incredible phenomenon. We don't have to go into detail there, but we know what happens. The Beatles stand out. They're incredibly celebrated. Beatlemania takes hold. And Dylan, who toured in England in March of 65, comes back, and he picked up a lot of clothes from Carnaby Street and King's Road in London. He's, very mod when he comes back. He's wearing, Beatle boots, really, and a leather jacket and a polka dot shirt at Newport. And he doesn't look anything like the Dylan from a year earlier, who dressed in cuffed jeans, cuffed denim, and a work shirt and a Pendleton shirt. And, he was a man of the people back then. But Dylan has an ego. And it turns out that a lot of these rock stars have egos, and that's what drives rock, and that's a good thing. And, the Beatles were certainly, full of themselves. It's a beautiful thing. That's what it's all about. And Dylan didn't really, the elders during that festival in 1965 put him in the wrong spot in the lineup, sort of to teach him a lesson that you're not more special than anybody else. Just because you have hits on the charts, the little people that haven't had a hit yet, you're not bigger than them. In folk, we're all the same. And Dylan bristled at that. Dylan hated that. Dylan felt, hey, I am more special than everybody else, and I should be given a special place here. Everybody who's writing about what we're doing is writing about how I'm changing things. I am special. I should stand out. And Dylan heard that the elders had slighted the Paul Butterfield band the day before, when they were being introduced by one of the elders sort of chided or belittled them when he announced that, here's a group that thinks it's a blues band. They're electric, so let's give them a shot. It was very condescending. And when Dylan heard that, he was incensed. This is all the backstory. So when he gets on stage, he doesn't care about electric one way or the other. I mean, that's the misnomer here. That's what comes out in my reporting. It's not that he wanted to play electric and nobody would let him. It's that they wouldn't let him be a star. They were trying to make him, they were marginalizing him at the Newport Folk Festival. And when he gets up there, he's got members of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band behind him. And a lot of these guys are playing electric instruments, electric organ. There's a drum set. I mean, folk never had it. I mean, if you were a folk artist in the 50s and early 60s, you could forget about a drummer and you could forget about a microphone and you could forget about amps. It was all acoustic and no drums. If you didn't have the beat, if you didn't have rhythm, shouldn't be up there performing. And that's basically their feeling. And so Dylan's got a drum kit up there. He's got electric instruments. He's plugged in and he's got his Stratocaster. And he basically says to the guys, crank it up. F these guys, turn up those amps. Problem is the board where they're setting all the levels, the mixer down in the audience, they weren't prepared for that getting cranked up. The microphones couldn't handle it. The equipment couldn't handle it. During their sound test, they hadn't configured for it. So when those amps get turned up on stage, you're getting a ton of distortion and the music is somewhat painful to the ear. And, the audience didn't like it. But the beauty of it is that, number one, Dylan felt he was special. And that's a great thing. Because if you're exceptional, you are special and you should get top billing and you should stand out. Because that's why people try to become exceptional, to stand out. Second, he's screwing with the hierarchy. He's screwing with the institution of folk. He's saying, I don't really care what you guys think. I'm bigger than you are, and we're going to play this music the way I feel like doing it. And the third important thing is that when that concert is over and that audience settles down and Dylan leaves the stage, a new form is born, and that's rock. Not rock and roll, but Dylan that night invents rock as we know it going forward.
That's fascinating. And I love the back and forth that Dylan had with the media. It's in San Francisco, I think, in 65 that
right. That December.
Well-known video is out there, man, and he just loved playing those games, those little back and forth. Somebody would ask him a question, and he would just kind of sort of answer it. He would just take a little jab here and there.
It's star, rock star. Rock is nothing without rock stars. Rock is about stars. Stars are exceptional. If you're better, if you're bigger, if you're greater, if you've got a larger audience, if you're selling more records, you are exceptional. That's capitalism. That's what rock was all about. It's whoever's better gets bigger billing. The Beatles arrive here. I mean, during that press conference, whether it's Shea, wherever it is, those guys, you can see on their faces they know they're hot stuff. They're top dogs. They know it. They don't have to be told. And it's all over their faces. They're oozing ego. We love that. That's a rock star. Dylan was a folk star. And by plugging in and by doing what he did that night, he became basically a folk rock star and basically starts rock, where the singer-songwriter is important. It's no longer Tin Pan Alley writing songs for groups. The artists themselves have to write their music. The artists themselves get to play what they want. The artists themselves decide what's going on their records. That's a rock star. That's the birth of rock. Right there, that night on the 25th,
Amazing.
1965.
And Pete Seeger is there that night, and there's the myth that he wanted to chop the main electrical wire with an axe. And George did debunk that myth.
Untrue.
Yeah, not true. Not true.
What Seeger said was, it's so loud, I wish I had an axe so I could cut the cable. It was a metaphor. It was hyperbole. It wasn't somebody go out and buy me an axe because I want to put a piece of steel through an electric cable and get electrocuted. I mean, it was a metaphor for I wish I could cut this thing off. He was reacting. I mean, if you listen to that concert, if you listen to those tracks, they're a little too loud, they're a little noisy, but they're coming from anger. That music that night is coming from anger. It's coming from frustration. It's coming from ego. And it's coming from a place where folk dies that night, because folk, after Bob Dylan gets finished that night, is no longer relevant.
People talk about Woodstock being maybe the most important concert of all time. But you look at that night, and its importance it can't be understated.
From the rock concert standpoint, it certainly is, because Dylan basically, he takes this thing called rock and roll, where people are wearing glittery cowboy Western kind of outfits, and they're banging the piano, and there's a lot of showmanship. And Dylan is the opposite of showmanship, right? You never know if he's sort of a straight face and he's just singing, and it's really the words. It's the birth of the singer-songwriter. Prior to Dylan, you had some songwriting. The Beach Boys are obviously writing their own stuff in the early 60s, but for the most part, a lot of these songs were written by, a lot of Elvis's songs. I mean, none of Elvis's songs are by Elvis, right? They're all written by, Lieber and Stoller or other incredible songwriters writing at the Brill Building. So back then, the formula was the Brill Building writes the songs, then somebody shops the songs around to artists, and then artists record the songs, and somebody has a hit with it. But the artists themselves weren't really responsible for writing the music or the lyrics. After Dylan, any artist who wasn't writing the music and the words was inferior.
The emergence of FM radio in the late 60s. I love this part of the book. You quote Don Law, the New England rock concert promoter. He gives credit to Tom Donahue, who early on, while working at KSAN in San Mateo, California, decided that FM radio could be a great medium to play rock albums. Initially, FM was positioned for classical music, but he thought this is the perfect platform for bands like the Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd, who play long-form music. And this is, in turn, when rock concerts really take off.
Yeah, as I write in my new book, Rock Concert, there's one word as to why FM takes off with rock. One word, and that word is stereo. AM is a mono format. FM was a stereo format. If you listen to it at home, it was in stereo, especially in the late 60s. Being someone who was around back then, you suddenly had stereo components, and you had these receivers, especially from Japan, integrated receivers that had radios on them. And for the first time, the FM band was on there, which meant you could go down the dial, switch to FM and listen to it, and suddenly FM was in stereo. Well, the albums, all the rock albums, were coming out in stereo by 1969, 1970. So FM was perfect for the album, not only because there was very little airtime being bought by advertisers and they needed to fill lots of time, so the albums could fill, they could play a whole side of an album for 20 minutes and eat up lots of time, because advertisers weren't buying space yet on the air on FM radio, not like they did in the later 70s. It was very little. It was almost barren. That's why you had college kids coming on there and playing. It was sort of like this pirate ship format for a long time. But once you have stereo records, that's the natural place for these rock albums to go, is onto FM, where you've got stereo, the music being broadcast in stereo, and people buying stereo systems, affordable stereo systems, in the home market.
One of the artists who became a huge commercial success thanks to FM radio was Steve Miller, and you spoke with him for the book. He's an interesting story. Originally from Wisconsin, heads to San Francisco, sees the potential for success as a musician because of the enormity of the concert scene and FM radio's growing audience. And he was the guy in the 70s, FM radio, he was it.
Yeah, Steve Miller, he first of all, he's a tremendous guy. I mean, he is just a wonderful, I interview rock stars all day long for my work at the Wall Street Journal. And, I'm dealing with these people all the time. Steve Miller is sort of he's a different cut, because he was on the freedom marches. He was a humanist. He was someone who cared a great deal about audiences. Remember, Steve Miller goes back to 1960. Steve Miller is on the bill at Monterey in 1967. He is performing at Monterey Pop. So Steve Miller is sort of like this thread that runs through almost every major concert going forward. And that's why he's such a great source. But he's, as a person, he really is a wonderful person. But through the 70s, he is touring like everybody else, touring like crazy throughout the country. And what they're finding is that by the late 1960s, very early 70s, but mostly the very tail end of the 60s, more cities you've got these college kids who graduate and then want to promote rock events, rock clubs. And they start these, what Steve amusingly refers to as these psychedelic dungeons, because wherever he'd go to play, they were kind of always the same. day glow paint on the inside. They were all sort of trying to mimic the Grateful Dead or the San Francisco experience. Because after the summer of love in 67, hippies go home and spread what was going on there all over the country. And then the rest of the youth culture kind of becomes the counterculture in effect. And, Steve Miller is playing all these cities, and many of them, whether it's New York or Philadelphia or Chicago, there are these places where there's no alcohol allowed because they wanted teenagers to be able to come to these clubs. And you've got they hold 1,000 people, and Led Zeppelin's playing 3 nights of the week, and Led Zeppelin leaves and the Who comes in, and the Who leave. I mean, it's just astonishing when you look at the playbills, when you look at the ads for these warehouses or former churches like the Boston Tea Party up in New England and the Electric Factory, Larry Maga's place in Philadelphia. You look at the ads for who's coming in, and it's like, you can't believe for $5 you're seeing Led Zeppelin and you're 25 feet from them, or the Who is coming in. But, this is the invasion. This is the second British invasion, when you've got all of these British rock bands coming in and performing throughout the country.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Chapter 10, titled Festival Mania, the Monterey Pop Festival, the Miami Pop Festival, and the most iconic festival of them all, Woodstock. But as Woodstock promoter Artie Cornfield told you, the legend of Woodstock wouldn't have been if not for the documentary film that came out afterwards. He said without it, Woodstock might have been just another forgotten 60s festival. I don't know. I knew of the legend of Woodstock without having seen the documentary.
But I'll bet somehow you wound up with either volume 1 or volume 2 of that album.
I did.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So it permeated the culture. In other words, the genius of Woodstock is that there were a ton of people there, 400,000 people. But the real genius is that they hired a film crew and they recorded it. And that, you have to understand that between 1966 and 69, when Woodstock takes place, there's maybe 3 dozen festivals, 4 dozen. I was astonished when you go down the list and see how many there were. There were dozens and dozens all over the country. But none of them, you don't know about any of them, because if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, did the tree really fall? If a rock concert, if a festival is held and there's no camera crew and there's no recording device, did that festival take place? In some respects, no, because it's not. Nobody remembers some of these festivals, or this river festival that took place up there. It just wasn't documented. But when the festival was documented, like Woodstock, and people, 400,000 people go there, but millions of kids look at that album cover or went to see that movie. And one thing they felt leaving that film, which is, man, I wish I had gone to that festival. I can't believe I didn't go. I really missed out on something huge. I should have gone. I really should have gone. And that's why the arenas take off. There's a reason why the arenas begin, which we can talk about, which is, the Altamont situation, which the Altamont Free concert that happens later that year, where there's a death and a lot of violence, and municipalities finally say, we're not allowing these concerts anymore. And rock has no choice but to go indoors for a variety of reasons: health reasons, safety reasons, weather reasons, and commercial reasons. But up until this point, nothing was really documented. Monterey Pop was. But between Monterey Pop and Woodstock, there was no real serious documentation, official documentation. Once there's documentation, then you create this mass appetite for people to go hear this music. And that's when the rock concert really takes off.
I could be wrong, but did they make up for a lot of the money they lost through that documentary film? Because I know they lost money, right, on the event.
Yeah. Yeah,
and I think the movie helped them to recoup a lot of that.
The movie was not only hugely popular, I believe it won an Oscar. It was best documentary. It's hard to quantify the seismic eruption, the seismic happening after Woodstock takes place. Not before, not during, but after. The reverberations go on for quite some time. You get all these kids who regret not going. You get this movie. You get these albums. Woodstock just basically, it becomes this one-word euphemism for mass popularity of this thing called rock, this documentation. People could see it for themselves. There's couples embracing under a blanket. There's people meeting other people there. There's people who got married after meeting people there. I mean, it's a major cultural event.
And some great photos taken too. Henry Diltz is the guy you spoke with. He's the Woodstock photographer. And guys like that have great stories. He shared a great story about shooting Jimi Hendrix from about 15 feet away. And it's at the moment when Jimmy is playing the national anthem. And at first, he's not understanding why Jimmy is playing that song. But then it hits him. Jimmy is reclaiming the anthem. He said, quote, as he played it, it became our song. There's that tremendous communal power of the rock concert you write about that's summed up in one moment there.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing you have to understand, which it's hard for listeners to understand this, is you had something back then going on called the draft. Any man who was approaching the age of 18 was shaking in his shoes, because all you knew was that everybody was coming back from Vietnam either in a body bag or on crutches, that Vietnam was just basically a death factory, and that your odds of surviving that without emotional scars and without physical scars or without being killed were pretty slim. And the draft was just horrific. Every guy was just dreading the draft. And the draft didn't end till like 73, 74. So you've got, at the time of Woodstock, you've got a lot of people there's a lot of anxiety going on in this age group. And that's why you have a lot of protest against the war. That's why you've got the youth culture. If the draft didn't exist, I don't know that you would have had a counterculture. But because the draft existed and because young people were trying to end this, what seemed like a mindless killing war for no reason that they could figure out. World War II made sense, but Vietnam didn't seem to make sense at all. And the fact that you would go there and come back, injured or dead, large numbers of people protested. And the Woodstock and all these events were sort of the soundtrack to that. But it's impossible to understand what was going on in this country in the late 1960s without dropping down the draft overlay. Everything related to the draft. Muhammad Ali got caught up in the draft. The draft was just this guillotine waiting to come down on your neck. And the only way you were going to get that war to end is if young people protested, and they did. And the war then did come to an end.
And Woodstock 69 was a peaceful event with all those people there, no violence. And that's the great statistic.
That was their purpose. When I spoke to all of the surviving producers, promoters of the Woodstock Festival, the whole point was they didn't want a big demonstration up there. It's just going to be too many people. They didn't want violence. They didn't want people riling people up from the stage about the police are the enemy, or go to Canada, don't go to the war. I mean, they didn't want the agitation. What they wanted was sort of what the Dead was preaching, the Grateful Dead, which is this quest for tranquility, this peacefulness. They wanted people to come up and just lay out in the field, girls to meet guys, guys to meet girls, guys to meet guys, girls to meet guys, people to make friends, get stoned, and listen to 4 days of music, and just relax and chill out. And that's exactly what happened, because they promoted it that way endlessly in advertising. 3 days of peace. I say 4 days because it actually went into Monday morning. That's when Hendrix plays. So it's a 4-day festival. But by the time everybody's up there and they're just hanging out and they're getting high and they're just listening to the music, unfortunately it rained for much of the time, so it was a mud bath. But everything was cool. Everybody, there were a few deaths, accidental deaths up there, but there was no stampede. 400,000 people, and there was no stampede. There were no major altercations. There was no rushing the stage. It was just people staying in their zone and just enjoying the music and trying to tough out the weather situation. And that's quite a miracle, really.
I went there, the site of Woodstock, and in the museum, they had a piece of paper that they were able to find from that site in 69. And it's so cool because this is long before the cell phones, and somebody they wrote a little message on a piece of paper and put it on the tree, and it said something, it was from some guy, and he said, "Hey, Laura with the yellow hat, if you see this, meet me at the such and such booth." That's the only way people could communicate. And then they had the phone booths there where people would make their phone calls, and the lines were going all the way out. People would, like, the kids would be calling their parents saying, I'm fine, I'm here, I made it. It was such a cool time. But then what happens next? What happens with the Altamont Free concert? That's December 6, 1969, a total opposite, marked by its violence, scores of injuries, the stabbing death of Meredith Hunter. Michael Lang, who helped put together Woodstock, he also organized the Altamont show. He said it was badly planned, very last minute, and once he saw that the Hells Angels were going to show up, they ride in that morning, they park at the front of the stage. That's when he knew it wasn't going to end well.
Altamont it was all wrong for a variety of reasons. The thing that I found most, which I document in my book, Rock Concert, my new book, but the thing that was most fascinating to me was the class difference between Woodstock and Altamont. Woodstock was largely a lot of college educated people on college breaks, young adults, people whose older brothers and sisters were in college. Altamont was a working class concert. It was a whole different trip. And there was a lot of hostility at Altamont, especially up front. And when the Dead shows up, there's a lot of people who are very stoned out. They're dropping a lot of acid as well. And the Hells Angels are highly violent at the concert because they were pretty much told to perform as security guards. And, it's like telling tigers, go kill your prey and chew them up. We don't really care. So these guys are just pretty much unleashed on the audience. They're given free beer. And you've got hostility between these guys who are not college educated in the audience, clashing with other working class people who are listening to this, listening to rock. And it's just, there's a class clash that's going on at Altamont. That's quite fascinating. That's very different from Woodstock. But keep in mind, there's an enormous number of people there. I forget the number, but it's significant. Tens of thousands of people. It's only the front rows. I mean, in all fairness to the people at Altamont, 80% of the people there were well behaved. They were just sitting and just listening to the music. It's that front section that became unruly.
Who was it that made the decision to have the Hells Angels be security? Who made that call?
I think the Rolling Stones unintentionally had them there. I think it was either the Dead or the Rolling Stones. I say in my book, I just can't recall. The Rolling Stones I think someone had asked the Dead, because the Hells Angels had hung around the Dead a lot, more peaceful variety of the role. It was interesting because I interviewed somebody who said the Hells Angels from San Francisco were very different from the Hells Angels that were all the way out in suburbia where this concert was held. This concert was held an hour outside of San Francisco, and a lot of people who were in San Francisco didn't even know where this place was. That's how far out it was. It's like Riverside, California is to Los Angeles. It's just way out in a whole different kind of people out there. It's just different folks are out there. It's a different environment. And when the Hells Angels show up and create trouble, the biggest flaw, the biggest mistake I think they made is Woodstock does something very smart. They build this wall in the front of the stage. First of all, they have the stage elevated high up, the Woodstock stage, in part so that everybody could see them if they filled the hills, and they did. You don't want a low stage because then people on the hills, people all the way in the back can't see what's going on. This is before those big, large, flat screens. At Altamont, and by the way, by putting up that wall, you wind up with people who are sitting far back from the wall. Why? Because if they're sitting close to that wall, you can't see the stage at all. So it was not only a natural barrier, but it forced people to sit far enough back that they wouldn't rush the stage. They'd have to be able to see the musicians, you had to sit far enough back that your eyesight could clear the stage. At Altamont, there was no wall. It was all hasty, as Michael Lang says. It was all because they had to switch venues several times, and by the time they set up, it was rushed. The stage only came up to your thigh. So people in the front were sitting on the stage, stoned out people were sitting on the speaker systems. I mean, the Stones feared for their lives. I mean, they bands, the Dead wouldn't even play. They were so afraid.
The Dead, you talk about Woodstock was another disaster for them. The stage was sinking in the mud where they played, right? They didn't want their set to be put into the film.
It could well be. I can't recall. It did pour for several days. There were many other problems that came up. There was a shortage of porta sands for people to use. There was a shortage of food. Fresh water was running out. Woodstock's great achievement is that they were lucky, because you could have had thousands of deaths at Woodstock. It could have been a mass casualty event. The National Guard, if the National Guard had come in to rescue people because thousands of people were being injured and killed, then you would have had riots as well. They were lucky it rained in many respects. The rain kept everybody mellow, kept everybody just hovering under ponchos to stay dry. But Woodstock got lucky. They weren't lucky at Altamont. And that stage, that low stage that people could climb right up on, was just begging for trouble.
You think about that. By the way, according to a quick search on the internet, it says 300,000 people at Altamont. Does that sound right?
Sounds right.
Okay.
Yeah.
The crazy thing is what could have happened. Can you imagine if one of the Stones is shot and killed at one of the, I mean, that's basically...
It's horrible to even think, because anybody who's been in a crowd anywhere, and you suddenly feel the crowd push, you feel the push of a crowd, people pushing you in one direction or another direction, like the undercurrent in the ocean, you sort of start to feel this terror. If something happens to you, you can't fall because you'll get trampled. So, and if you stay standing up, you might get pressed into a wall and crushed to death. There's enormous fear that happens. And, Altamont, it's a miracle. Well, like I said, 80% of that audience was well-behaved. 80% of that audience may have been so stoned out of their minds that they just wanted to listen to the music in the dark. But you really had a situation where at either of those two concerts, you could have had major casualties. After Altamont, local communities finally get the message, and states and cities and towns no longer allow these kinds of concerts unless a long list of criteria are met, including you have to have X number of porta sands, you have to have fresh water constantly being served, you have to have a health booth, you have to have medical care someplace, you need X number of security people there. There was this whole long laundry list. So keep in mind, rock concerts are held outdoors in the years to come. Most specifically, the largest concert ever held up until that point, which was Watkins Glen, where you had 600,000 people show up. But that was at a racetrack, and you had to pay. It was at a speedway, and you had to. They collected money. It wasn't, the turnstiles weren't knocked down. It wasn't overrun. You had order. You had everything that the local area needed in terms of facilities. And then you have California Jam, which comes a couple of years, the following year, 75. Watkins Glen 74, which is even larger, but it's all sanctioned by local communities because criteria were met for health and safety issues, standards that were met.
Crazy. Marc Myers' book, Rock Concert, An Oral History as Told by the Artists, Backstage, Insiders, and Fans Who Were There, is out now. Should mention Albert Maysles is in your book. He produced the 1970 documentary Gimme Shelter along with his brother David, and he's the one who said that when Meredith Hunter pulled the gun, he looked as though he was going to shoot Mick or one of the guys in the Stones. That's how serious things got.
Albert died a bunch of years ago, but I interviewed him for the Wall Street Journal. I think it was either 2009 or 10, maybe 2010. And when I went to see Albert, I wanted to interview him, but I wanted to interview him while we both watched a screening of Gimme Shelter. So he had the film queued up, and we were the only two people in his theater. He had this little theater up in Harlem. That's part of his offices there. And we watched a print of Gimme Shelter. And Albert, so many years later, was still so animated by what he and his brother David had documented in their film, Gimme Shelter. But those quotes that are in the book by Albert Maysles were actually given to me in the movie theater while we were watching Gimme Shelter. At one point, I was watching Albert's face. Albert was watching the movie, and in the movie, Mick Jagger is looking at the editing screen because he's watching the movie. There was this funny sequence of me watching Albert, watching Mick Jagger, watching the film being edited on these projectors that allowed you to edit film. But that was all. That interview was conducted while we were watching Gimme Shelter.
Wow, that's wild. What was going through his head while he's watching?
If you can't go to Altamont, you call Albert and get it screened, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a lot safer and drier.
So we move now into the era where Rolling Stone magazine really starts to have an influence now. Chapter 11 is titled Image, Media, and Branding, and you lead with the importance of Rolling Stone magazine. You spoke with writer Cameron Crowe, who talked about how the magazine's coverage of all of these artists played a huge role in bringing even more people to concerts. Can you talk about Rolling Stone's importance?
Yeah, I mean, as I talk about in my book, Rock Concert, that's out now, journalism changes in the 1960s. It's called euphemistically the new journalism, where magazine articles and writers are writing more novelistic. They're not just writing, here's what happened. They're bringing their own impressions or their own takes on what's going on. And it makes for a more emotional read. And you're seeing this pop up in magazines in the late 60s. Rolling Stone adapts this. And Cameron Crowe is one of the first, I mean, he's 15 years old when he starts at Rolling Stone. You know, he goes on tour with the Allman Brothers. But, you know, the new journalism prior to Rolling Stone and Jan Wenner, the founder, and Cameron Crowe and all the other writers there, prior, rock and roll magazines were really teen magazines for girls. You know, the covers would be things like Mickey Dolenz of the Monkees has a new girlfriend. Sonny and Cher aren't really married. You know, it was all that kind of stuff. But it was aimed at the teenage girl market, you know, who had crushes on all these. You know, in all fairness, I mean, it's the only place where kids, specifically teenage girls, preteen girls, could see what these people looked like. Like they could see who the Monkees were on the cover of an album or Herman of Herman's Hermits. But to see them in photographs and to read articles about them, that's what these teen magazines were. So Rolling Stone is it's a more adult, more grown up, more guy and gal driven, and it's more about lifestyle. It's really for the person who embraced the rock and roll lifestyle, counterculture lifestyle.
I'm very curious to get your thoughts on the 70s. We get to the era where bands are playing arenas and stadiums like Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles. They come to mind. Some bands, some artists, they didn't want to play those venues because a lot of the people in the audience are too far away. They don't get the full experience. Some didn't feel that way, and they'll say, it doesn't matter where you're sitting. You're still enjoying that experience. Where do you stand on that?
I think you've answered your own question there, because it depends upon the artist, right? You know, I don't want to see Crosby, Stills, and Nash at Wembley Stadium, even though they toured, you know, if they were together, they're not, obviously. But I mean, it depends upon the group. I mean, if it's an intimate group, I want to see them in an intimate venue, a few thousand people, you know, where they can really, like Steely Dan, to me, is perfect for a 2,000, 3,000 venue. If you're talking about Queen only makes sense at a stadium or an arena. So it really depends upon the artist.
The 70s marked a time when fashion was important. Mark Bolan of T-Rex, David Bowie, the New York Dolls come to mind. You spoke with the drummer of T-Rex, Bill Legend, Todd Rundgren, and also Norma Kamali, a pioneering fashion designer. She had a boutique in New York. She told you that by the early 70s, half her customers were men.
Yeah. But, you know, spandex it's an invention of this new technology called synthetic wear. I mean, things that stretched, that wasn't made of cotton, things that could be just tossed in the wash, and things that were costumey and theatrical. And you had a lot of guys, especially, you know, glitter and glam guys who were performing, could dress in these tight, spandexy kinds of things. And you'd have the beginning of gender changing and asexuality in the music. I mean, it's just fascinating how rock evolves over the years and what causes it to change, what causes these forms of rock to change. And the concerts themselves are suddenly addressing new issues that hadn't surfaced before, but suddenly are being dealt with, or at least certain people who have always been thought of as outcasts in kid culture, they're suddenly hearing in music and seeing in artists something that is catering to them, that they feel is celebrating what they're into and what they're about.
But then you also had a band who didn't have a look. The Grateful Dead, in the 70s, they accumulated a massive fan base. Their approach is interesting in that they didn't put much attention into stage presence or how they dressed. It was about the music. It's everything that I guess the average business-minded guy would tell you not to do, yet they did it their way and it paid off to this day. And the two things that I always think about that are at the core of the Grateful Dead success and their growing success over the years from the 60s, 70s into the 80s and beyond, changing the set list every night and allowing the fans to tape the shows. I would not have been a fan myself if I didn't get a bootleg of a May 1977 show at New Haven from my brother. From that moment on, I was a fan. And that's the case with a lot of Grateful Dead fans to this day. That's how they became fans.
Yeah, I mean, Jerry Garcia, it wasn't so much that they wanted everybody to tape the concerts and pass tapes around. That wasn't their motive, although that was the metastasization. That's the final analysis of that business. But it was really because they couldn't stop it. And if they were going to constantly play cop and have security dragging some kid out who was trying to tape a concert, it was going to ruin the vibe. You know, it was just going to ruin their tranquility vibe that they really prized so much. I mean, they just wanted people to come and be peaceful and just listen to the music and groove out. And if you're going to have security rushing down all the time to stop people from taping, they just said, well, just let them tape. Who cares?
I think it was Bob Weir that told you he really didn't understand why people wanted to tape all of their shows.
Except the Dead were big tapers of their own shows. As I, in fact, just wrote about the Dead tonight for the Wall Street Journal. The anniversary of Skull and Roses is October 24th of 71, which is 50 years ago. And I've got a big piece in the Wall Street Journal on the anniversary and why this album is so important. But they almost neurotically recorded their own concerts, not so much to listen to how they performed, although they performed better live than in the studio, of course. I mean, they loved playing live because they could go long and they could improvise and they could come up with all kinds of things through experimentation. But the thing about the Dead is that by allowing for recording and by playing this way, you created a market. And by taping all of your own concerts, they basically had cash. By releasing live albums, by getting all these tapes that they had, releasing live albums, they were able to pay off debt. Not only studio debt for one of their first albums, but then they were able to pay off debt on, the Wall of Sound, which practically bankrupted the band at one point. The expensive, massive audio system, speaker system that they put up on stage that was just gigantic. They went into debt on those things. The live albums paid those bills. By taping everything all the time, they were printing cash. Anytime they wanted to release a live album without having to spend money, they had the reels. They could just put together an album and it was all money without any overhead.
You did write in your book how much importance they placed on the sound. So they put a lot of money into the sound. That was real important to them.
Big. They were perfectionists when it came to sound.
Why don't more bands take the Grateful Dead approach and change their set list drastically each night?
Because I think the Dead was unique in that they had been playing for so long that they could improvise. They were almost, they're a country rock band, but I kind of hear them as a fusion band, as a jazz fusion band, where they're so skilled as musicians and they're so skilled as partners. They can read each other. They know what's coming. In many ways, they didn't even have a set list. I mean, there's a set list after the fact, but for the most part, these guys, they didn't know what they were going to play next. Jerry might play a couple of bars or something and they'll go into it. But from what Bob Weir told me and from everything that I've read, there was no real set list. They might decide to play something or they might, hey, let's try out these 3 songs. But there was very little formality. That's how good they were, that they could play a few chords and then they could go right into one song and then go into another song. And they were one of the most seamless bands, I think, in rock.
Easier said than done, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's why these guys were together for so long, because, you needed somebody who could be intuitive, somebody who could be flexible, and someone who could play imaginatively and experimentally for long periods of time. The whole Dead ethos was that they could play for long periods of time. That's why you had Deadheads. That's why you had people following them, because it's like going to the ice cream store. These guys didn't play ice cream cones. They played buckets of soft serve sundaes. I mean, it's like you went for the sundaes. You went for the cherry and the whipped cream and the marshmallow, all the stuff they were doing for hours on end. It wasn't just, oh, I really like their music. It was, I like their music, and then, wow, they really deliver value. They really deliver an enormous amount of quantity.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Want to ask you about the 1980 Pink Floyd tour to support The Wall. That is legendary. And you spoke with Roger Waters for the book, Rock Concert, and the people involved with that tour as well. Rocky Paulson, the concert rigger for that tour, he talked about how he built a monorail system to fly the pigs above the audience. He used aircraft landing lights for the pig's eyes. Roger really put time into the details, and those details were expensive. There weren't many shows, right? I can't remember. I think it was something like 20, 25, maybe 30 shows.
Yeah, it was Los Angeles, New York, and London, and it was just it lasted, I think, in late 80 into 81, but it wasn't like 7 concerts here, 7 concerts there. I think they did like 3 or 4 in one city, 3 in another. They played in Long Island. I think they played New York, and then they played in London as well. But essentially what you've got, with the Wall is rock reaching operatic levels. This is just opera-sized stuff. And they can do it because the technology had changed, and that the people who put this stuff up had been trained in large-scale events for families like Disney on Parade. So they knew how to do this stuff. And, Roger's vision was pure rock and roll, but at the same time, it was operatic and big.
Chapter 17, titled Killing the Radio Star, MTV broke bands overnight. Not just record sales, but ticket sales. And as Mark Goodman told you, look what it did for the already established artists like Bruce Springsteen. Took him to a whole new level.
Yep. Suddenly rock becomes something you see and not just hear. And as a result, special effects, costume, hair, makeup, all kinds of things that didn't really play a role in rock suddenly are very important, because kids were no longer listening to the radio under their pillow. They were begging their parents to get cable TV and subscribe to MTV. And then you'd have, I remember seeing MTV. It wasn't available in New York City immediately, strangely enough. It was only available in the suburbs, which is where cable found its original audience. Buildings weren't wired up yet, and homes were. And I remember going up to a friend's house, and there were 20 people there watching MTV. And I think we started watching at 10 in the morning, and I think we stopped watching at midnight. You just couldn't take your eyes off of it.
Yeah, I can still remember this day, channel number 52 on my cable dial. You come home from high school and you watch MTV.
That's it.
It was huge. And also 80s is when Ticketmaster revolutionized the ticket business. I found this part of your book, Rock Concert, fascinating because I didn't know Ticketmaster started back in the 60s. And it was their president, Frederick D. Rosen, who in 1982 took over, and he helped Ticketmaster become a huge success. And he told you how he went about it in great detail, too. He made some changes with service charges and revenue sharing. He also saw that most tickets were sold at the venue's box office in 1982, so he saw the potential in Ticketron's electronic system. People wouldn't have to wait in line and camp out to get a ticket. A brilliant move on his part, not a popular move.
There were 2 phenomena in 1982. One is that bank CDs, certificates of deposit, were paying 12%, which, it's just like imagine getting a return on your investment at 12%. That's what CDs were paying you for their investment. And the second one, which is more important, is that if you could sign your name and you had a job, you could apply and get a credit card. Everybody in 1982 who was working could get a credit card, their first credit card. And once you had a credit card, you could call up on the phone and you could buy stuff without ever leaving your house. You want to buy tickets, you just call up and give your credit card number, and you got tickets waiting for you at the box office. What Fred did is he turned rock into a business, a bigger business, because his feeling was, why should tickets to see the Lakers and why should tickets to see a Broadway show be $200, but to see David Bowie or Elton John, that should be $20. He basically put rock in the same league as Broadway and professional sports.
Was what he did good or bad for the business? Pearl Jam.
I don't think it's good or bad. I think it's like you have 3 choices, right? You can either go to the concert and pay the money, pay what it's worth. Nobody charges more than what something's worth. Otherwise, you won't sell any seats. So if people are willing to pay $200 to go see the Stones at that point in time, or $500 today, well, you have a choice. Nobody has a gun to your head, and nobody's telling you you must buy Rolling Stone tickets. So you either can pay the service charge, you either pay what it's going for, pay what it's worth, or you can go to the box office and avoid the service charges. But that's incredibly inconvenient because you'll have to, travel to the box office and buy them. Or you have this third choice, and that's you don't go. So it's just that rock for years had been this thing that should be free. It came out of San Francisco, this notion that music was supposed to be free, concerts were supposed to be free. Kids didn't mind, kids bought albums, and in return, they should get free concert music. That was the ethos back then. And Fred's thinking was, fine, that was then. But at this point in time, it's a bigger deal, and we can command more dollars. And for the convenience of buying it without having to travel, you have to pay a service fee. And guess what? If you don't, he told me this very funny story about this woman who wrote him a letter saying, I'm never going to another concert again. You know, how dare you charge me $2.50 for a service charge? It's just robbery. I'm never going again. I'm never using Ticketmaster again. And Fred, can't remember whether he wrote her or called her up, but he said to her, listen, I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to refund your money, but I'm also going to ask that you never use my service again. And she goes, well, yeah, that's fine with me. He goes, you know, you'll just have to travel to the arena. You'll have to wait in line there, and you'll have to wait and then buy your ticket. You may have to wait overnight, and you'll buy your ticket, and there won't be a service charge. And then you'll have to travel home and then travel back to the arena to see the concert. He goes, but that's okay. You'll have your $2.50. And she goes, well, wait a second. He goes, well, I'm providing you with a service. You have to pay me a fee. That's how it is. You do that with everything else. You go to the store and buy something, you have to pay for the product. This is the same thing. You're paying for the product. You don't have to pay for the product. You just don't have to go to the concert.
So
she goes,
true.
well, okay, you know, I'll pay the fee. I'll pay the fee.
She changed her mind. Yeah, Pearl Jam was the one that went up against Ticketmaster in the mid 90s. And then it became Metallica going up against the file sharers. The business model is always changing. There's always going to be either you keep up with it or you fall behind, and you'd be like that woman waiting in line or traveling a hell of a long way just to get your tickets. But yeah, so it's interesting how you end your book. You bring the readers right up to 1985's Live Aid, which you say in many ways was the last pure rock concert.
It's the last big concert where ticket prices are reasonable and it's put on by old school promoters. It's the last pure rock concert before the rock concert becomes something else. You know, it's just a natural break point. A number of people I were interviewing, this kept coming up in interviews, that Live Aid was a turning point. I would constantly hear Live Aid was a turning point. You know, up until Live Aid, it was this way. After Live Aid, it was that way. But as I say in my book, Rock Concert, that's out now, Live Aid, it's a charity event, but it's, you know, it attracts 90,000 people in New York. It's about 70,000 people in London, takes place at the same time. But it's the old rock concert swan song.
And you feel a lot of this has to do with the average age of the audiences? Really,
it's that the rock concert went corporate, that, you know, corporations finally figured out how to make tons of money on concerts, and as they should. Movie stars make $80 million a movie. Why shouldn't a Mick Jagger or Paul McCartney or somebody you love to see live, why shouldn't they make money too? I mean, there's a sense that lingered from the 60s that rock stars are us, that they should be closer to us, that we should be able to, that we help get them where they are, and in return they should give us free music. And as early as 71, people like Neil Young and Joni and other people were saying, well, why shouldn't we get paid to do what we do? I mean, we're exceptional. Why shouldn't we get paid? And they're right. Everybody should get paid for what they're worth.
Can the concert industry recover from COVID?
I think so, but I think it's going to be very different. I think live events are going to have to start incorporating a streaming component, so that if I want to watch it from my home and pay $50 to see the Stones in concert anywhere in the world they're performing, I should be able to do that if that's what I want to do. And the price point will find its own way. But I think streaming will be something that'll come out of this somehow. And I also think that that you'll have more control over concerts, meaning you'll be able to control the camera angle. You'll control whether you want to be zoomed in on the person, or do you want to see what's going on in the audience. I think you'll be able to choose from like 6 or 7 different cameras ultimately. But I think it's an add-on. I think people still love live music, but you just don't know. We could come out of this and people just don't want to go out anymore. It's hard to see how that's the case, but maybe it is.
They may take their cue from the movie business. I went out to the theater to go see the new Halloween movie, and then I find out that it's on free on Peacock, and I have Peacock. I'm like, well, wait a minute, I could have watched it at home. Which, I mean, I didn't mind going to the theater, but it's crazy to think that you could pay whatever it costs for a movie ticket.
And like, you go to the movies. I last time I saw a movie was, I think, 18 years ago.
Really?
At the movie theater.
Really?
Well, I mean, like, you go there and like the floors are sticky. The two people behind you are talking the whole movie. Somebody's unwrapping candy next to you all the time. And invariably, the people in front of you are just like bouncing in their seats back and forth, or they're laughing or something. It's just, our culture has become rude. So, and like, if you interrupt somebody's rudeness, they take it personally, as if you're trying to stop them from behaving the way they want to. And it's just theater situation for a movie where so many people are accustomed to watching things alone or with their girlfriend or their boyfriend or their spouse just at home while eating popcorn or something. Now you have to share space with large numbers of people, and everybody wants to behave like they're at home. It just creates a lot of friction and tension.
Is there a similar problem with concerts, you think? I know people are worried about their safety in concerts nowadays.
I mean, what pisses me off at concerts is like the invariable couple that gets up to dance to the song that they like, and you can't see. And then everybody gets up and you have to stand the whole concert. You don't know why you bought a seat when you should have been standing the whole time. I mean, it's just, there's a lot that's annoying at concerts. I mean, if everybody sat down and enjoyed the music, that would be great. But people just want to do what they want to do. And if you interrupt them from doing it, you're moving into fight territory or argument territory or worse. It's like, why bother?
Or it could be like a friend of mine who said some guy got real drunk and threw up in his seat, and then when he went to sit down, he sat down, and it's some
just
nasty
disgusting
stuff.
It's like crowds have become disgusting because people they're not behaving. It's not civilized anymore. It's I should be able to do what I want. Too bad for everybody else, which is great, I guess, sometimes. But in a situation where you're sharing space with other people, not so great. Why put yourself in that kind of situation at a movie theater or anywhere else? I know I sound like I'm about 130 years old, but
not
I'm
at all. Not at all.
I just like civilized people.
Yeah.
I like to enjoy entertainment like everybody else, but I don't think somebody has more rights than I do to sort of stand up and dance. And if I ask them to sit down because I can't see, then that's going to cause friction because they're going to feel humiliated, or they're going to feel like I'm being a grouch or something. You know, it's like that. I just why bother going?
Rock Concert, an oral history as told by the artists, backstage, insiders, and fans who were there is out now. You end with a list of the 50 best live albums, concert films, and rock docs of all time, and you break them down by decade, the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So I'm going to put you on the spot. What are your personal number one picks? Best live album among the 50?
I can't give you number one, but why don't I give you 5 of each?
Okay.
I would say my favorite live albums would probably be Jerry Lee Lewis live at the Star Club, The Who's live at Leeds, the Allman Brothers at Fillmore East, David live. I'd probably go with Steve Miller, the Steve Miller Band live in '77 that came out this year from his '77 tour, which is an amazing album. If you haven't heard that album, the Steve Miller Band, the new live album from '77, it's amazing. And I would say Talking Heads Stop Making Sense. Those are my favorite live albums. As far as concert films, I would say Ron Howard's 8 Days a Week, about the Beatles on the road between 1962 and 1966. The Tammy Show, which is an unbelievable concert that was held in Los Angeles in the 60s. Woodstock, great concert film. Wattstacks, another great concert film. Ziggy Stardust. And I would say Mad Dogs and Englishmen with Joe Cocker and Leon Russell.
No Last Waltz?
Yeah, I mean, Last Waltz is, Last Waltz, I would, I'm looking at the list if I would sub one of these out. It's either Mad Dogs and Englishmen or Last Waltz.
Okay. And then what about
documentaries?
Best rock doc.
I would say the Maisel Brothers, Beatles in the USA, Beatles Come to America. It's a black and white documentary that Albert Maisels made when the Beatles arrived in 1964 in February, and he was the only documentarian there at the airport and followed them to the plaza, was with them. It was wasn't unauthorized, it was authorized. He was with them, but it's an unbelievable documentary of the Beatles' arrival in the U.S. The film called The Wrecking Crew, which is about studio musicians in the 60s. Gimme Shelter, of course, great documentary. BBC's Motown Invasion. The Beatles came to America in '64, but what people don't know, little known event, is that Motown toured in Britain at about the same time. And it's how Motown caught on in Britain while they were on tour in the UK. Also from the BBC, which you can find on YouTube, The Rise of Southern California Rock, and it's called From the Birds to the Eagles. It's a fascinating documentary on the rise of Laurel Canyon and that whole period. And I would say the 6-parter on the Grateful Dead, Long Strange Trip, which I think I read someplace you saw that 25 times.
Yeah,
just kidding.
But I have seen it. That's a current documentary that just came out
A couple of years ago. Yeah,
that is very good. Yeah,
incredible.
Those are good picks.
It gives you a sense of the time period, the choice of the talking heads, and that the choice of the people who were talking was brilliant. And also the story of why the Dead are important really comes through. If you know nothing about the Grateful Dead, go on to Amazon. I think it's Amazon or Netflix. I can't remember, but look for, it's called Long Strange Trip. And there's 6 parts. It's like a series, like any of these series that run on there. You can binge it, but it's just a fascinating 6-part series on the Grateful Dead.
That's cool. Bob Weir looks like Jerry now.
Everybody looks like Jerry now.
Yeah, we look more and more like Jerry. I'm looking up at it. I got a framed picture of him right here, right in front of me. Okay, so very good picks, but no Kiss Alive and no UFO Strangers in the Night. No.
Sorry. Second floor.
Second floor.
Second floor. You asked me for the top.
Yeah.
If all you could watch were these, start with these and then move on to others. Keep in mind, it doesn't mean that I give the reader 50 of each. So 50 of those are favorites of mine, or else I wouldn't have included them. But you asked me to pick 5 of each. You actually asked me to pick 1, and I gave you 5 of each.
Yeah. I didn't ask you, too. What was the first concert you ever went to?
My first concert was in October of 1971, and I went to see Santana at the Felt Forum in New York. Felt Forum was sort of like a mini theater adjacent to the new Madison Square Garden.
And your best concert ever?
That's impossible to say, because what I've found through my interviews is that a best concert can have nothing to do with the music at all. It could be who you met. It could be the person you brought. It could be what you ate beforehand. It could be how fast it took you to get home. So, I did get to see, Bowie. I got to see pretty much everybody, and I can't say that any of them were really bad, but I would say there's no best, because the more I think of one, I start thinking of another.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of external issues, because keep in mind, the rock concert was a rite of passage. You went in a kid, you came out a young adult, and it wasn't so much who was playing as the excitement and the thrill of seeing stars on stage. Kids, you didn't really see movie people. You went to the movies, but most kids didn't see movie actors. You didn't ever get to see them. Rock was different. You got to see the people you were listening to, and that was such a thrill.
Rock concert and oral history as told by the artists, backstage insiders, and fans who were there. It is out now through Grove Press.
And Eric, it's a fast read. It reads like a dart, right?
I loved it. I loved it.
Thank you so much. It's very sweet.
It's available wherever books are sold, but is there any website you want to direct people to get a copy? Any specifics?
No, it's either you can go to the Grove Press website, grovepress.com, or you can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, anywhere. Just click, boom. And it's the only rock concert this fall you won't need a mask to enjoy.
You're right. That's true.
Right?
So
no
true.
Mask. No mask at all.
Website that you have, social media pages?
Yep. Right now, jazzwax.com. But coming very shortly will be rockconcerthistory.com. Will be up very shortly, I think in about a week. So they're just finishing it up. But if you type in my name, markmyers.com, you'll wind up there anyway.
This was great. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, Eric, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again to Marc Myers for taking us through his book, Rock Concert, an oral history as told by the artist, backstage insiders, and fans who were there. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just Mark, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore is on our show notes page. And make sure you subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. Find us online at bookedonrock.com. On Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast. On Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening, and join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.